The mop bucket rolled across the tarmac with a hollow scrape, pushed by hands that had once guided a Super Hornet through Iranian airspace at Mach 1.4. Ilara Voss wore navy blue coveralls 2 sizes too large, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a regulation bun that nobody regulated anymore. The young pilots didn't see her. They never did. She was 53, invisible, another face in the machinery of Nellie's Air Force Base, where legends were born and janitors were furniture. But on her chest, barely visible beneath the oversized coveralls, hung a patch most of them had only seen in declassified photographs. Hell's Angels, first chapter. Not the motorcycle club, the real one. The Flying Tiger's spiritual descendants, the squadron that didn't officially exist on any roster but appeared in every fighter pilot's nightmare scenario. The squadron that flew when diplomacy died and politicians needed plausible deniability. She cleaned the ready room at 400 hours, moving between leather chairs still warm from the previous night's briefing. On the whiteboard, someone had drawn a cartoon of an old woman with a mop labeled Grandma Ground Crew. The newer pilots laughed about it yesterday. Captain Derek Halston, 28 years old with 72 training hours, had added the wrinkles himself. Ilara had smiled politely and emptied his trash can. The base had been her sanctuary for 3 years now, ever since the medical board declared her unfit for combat operations, after the incident over the Strait of Hormuz. Officially, her reflexes had degraded. Officially, her psychological evaluation suggested PTSD. Unofficially, she disobeyed a direct order and saved 14 Marines by doing exactly what the manual said never to do. The alert klaxon split the pre-dawn silence like an axe through bone. Ilara's hands stopped moving. Her body remembered before her mind caught up. That sound meant scramble, meant threat level critical, meant the kind of morning where body bags got counted before breakfast. Through the ready room windows, she watched the pilots sprint from the barracks, flight suits half-zipped, faces still creased from pillows. Halston led the pack, all confidence and academy-trained swagger. The operations center erupted in controlled chaos, voices overlapping on multiple frequencies, but one transmission cut through the noise like a scalpel. Multiple bogies, bearing 090, altitude Angels 20, electronic warfare signatures consistent with fifth-generation hostile aircraft. This is not a drill. All available aircraft to runway immediately. Ilara's mop clattered to the floor. Her coveralls suddenly felt like a burial shroud. Outside, the first F-35 screamed toward the runway, afterburners painting the Nevada dawn orange and violet. But she counted them. Only 4 birds flight-ready. The rest were down for maintenance, scattered across the base in various states of mechanical undress. 4 jets against an unknown number of hostiles using electronic warfare. The math was simple and brutal. The operations center smelled like burnt coffee and testosterone. Ilara stood in the doorway, still holding her mop like a weapon, watching the tactical display paint a picture that made her blood crystallize. 16 hostile contacts, spread in a perfect pincer formation, closing on Las Vegas airspace at 620 knots. Whoever was flying those aircraft understood strategy the way poets understood metaphor. The 4 American jets looked like chess pieces being maneuvered into a beautiful, inevitable checkmate. Colonel Marcus Reeves stood at the center of the chaos, his jaw working like he was chewing through steel cables. 55 years old, veteran of 3 wars, a man who'd earned his stars by being right when everyone else was catastrophically wrong. He was watching his pilots prepare to die, and everyone in the room knew it. "Sir," Ilara's voice cut through the chatter, quiet but sharp enough to draw blood. "You need more aircraft." Heads turned. Halston, suited up and ready to sprint to his jet, actually laughed. "Grandma, this isn't the time for." "Captain, shut your mouth before I have you removed." Reeves didn't look away from the display, but his words landed like artillery shells. He knew her voice. He'd flown her wing once back when the world was different and Ilara Voss was the nightmare that enemy pilots whispered about. "Voss, you're grounded. Medical board was clear." "Medical board said my reflexes were compromised, sir. They tested me in a simulator designed for 20-year-olds hopped up on energy drinks. She moved closer, dropping the mop against the wall. Under her coveralls, that patch pressed against her chest like a brand. Those bogies are flying a Surkov bracket, modified for electronic warfare. Russian doctrine, Chinese execution. They're counting on our response being exactly what we're giving them: aggressive, straightforward American. The room went silent except for the tactical computer's steady beeping. Reeves finally turned, and his eyes found that patch through her partially unzipped coveralls. His face went through several expressions at once: recognition, respect, calculation. The Surkov bracket hasn't been used in combat since Syria. 2019. How do you? Because I've flown against it, sir. Not in a simulator, not in a training exercise, in actual combat over the Caspian Sea when we weren't supposed to be there. Her voice carried weight, each word a small caliber truth. I lost my wingman to that formation. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, call sign Whisper. She died because we responded exactly the way our doctrine said to respond. The bracket eats doctrine for breakfast and asks for seconds. Halston opened his mouth, probably to say something about protocol or chain of command, but Lieutenant Grace Morrison, 34, quiet, competent, put a hand on his arm. She'd been listening, really listening. The tactical display updated. 12 minutes until hostile contact with Las Vegas airspace. Civilian population, 2.3 million people who were drinking their morning coffee, completely unaware that their lives hung on decisions being made in a concrete bunker under the Nevada desert. Reeves stared at Alara like she was a ghost made flesh, which in a way she was. The Alara Voss who'd flown for the Hells Angels had died 3 years ago in a hospital bed at Walter Reed, her career suffocated by paperwork and bureaucratic cowardice. This woman in oversized coveralls was supposed to be the corpse left behind. "You're telling me," Reeves spoke slowly, choosing each word like ammunition, "that you know how to counter this formation." "I'm telling you that sending 4 jets into a Surkov bracket is tactical suicide dressed up as bravery, sir. They'll split your formation, jam your communications individually, and kill your pilots one by one while they can't even talk to each other. You'll have 4 debris fields before your birds get a single weapons lock." Alara moved to the display, her finger tracing the hostile formation. But the bracket has a weakness. It requires perfect coordination. The wingmen on each element have to maintain specific intervals, 30-second windows where they're vulnerable during transition phases. If you know the timing, how would you even get airborne? Major Patricia Kwon, the air operations officer, cut in. Her voice wasn't hostile, just brutally practical. You haven't flown combat in 3 years. No current flight physical. No active security clearance for weapons systems, even if the colonel wanted to authorize it. "There's a bird on pad 7. Alara didn't look away from the display. F-16C, the Block 52 we've been using for aggressor training. She's old, subsonic by modern standards, but she's flight-ready and armed with live AIM 120s for the exercise that was supposed to run next week. I can be wheels up in 4 minutes." The room erupted, voices overlapping, doctrine being quoted, regulations being thrown around like grenades. But Alara heard only the klaxon, still wailing somewhere in the distance, and the memory of Whisper's last transmission. "They're in my head, Valkyrie. They're in my head and I can't see them." That had been her call sign once. Valkyrie, the chooser of the slain. She'd chosen wrong that day, and Whisper had paid the price. Reeves held up his hand. Silence fell like a hammer. "Lieutenant Morrison, how long until hostile weapons range on civilian airspace?" 9 minutes, sir. "And our 4 birds?" 6 minutes to intercept, but with electronic warfare," Morrison's voice trailed off. The math spoke for itself. The colonel's face looked carved from granite that had seen too many bad wars. He turned to Alara, and something passed between them, recognition of a simple truth that every combat pilot eventually learned. Rules were written by people who survived. Doctrine was created by committees who never had to dodge missiles at 40,000 feet while their wingman's fighter disintegrated into aluminum confetti. Sometimes the only difference between massacre and miracle was one grounded pilot who remembered how the dead had died. "Major Kwon, get her a flight suit and a medical waiver. I'll sign it myself." Reeves' voice carried the weight of a man burning every bridge to his retirement. "Captain Halston, you're now flying as her wingman. Call sign Valkyrie is taking tactical command of this intercept." Halston's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Sir, she's a janitor. She hasn't. She's a pilot who survived what you're about to fly into, Captain. You can follow her orders or you can clean toilets until your grandchildren retire. Choose quickly." Reeves turned back to the display. "Voss, you have 3 minutes to reach that aircraft. We'll vector the other 4 jets to support positions, but you'll be lead. If this goes wrong..." "If this goes wrong, sir, I'm already dead. Medical board killed me 3 years ago. This is just my ghost getting some flight time." Alara was already moving, stripping off the coveralls as she ran. Beneath them, she wore compression gear, always prepared for a moment she told herself would never come. The Hell's Angels patch went into her pocket, pressed against her heart. Lieutenant Morrison sprinted alongside her, carrying a flight suit that smelled like jet fuel and possibility. The Nevada dawn was turning the sky the color of arterial blood as they burst onto the tarmac. The F-16 sat on pad 7 like a metallic prayer, older than most of the pilots on base but maintained with religious fervor. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez was already running pre-flight, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 30 years. He saw Alara approaching and didn't even blink. "Heard the commotion on the radio, ma'am. She's ready. I loaded the good missiles, not the training rounds." "Figured if you were flying again, it was because God ran out of other options." Alara smiled, brief and sharp. "Or the devil got impatient, Chief." "Either way, ma'am, give 'em hell." He handed her the helmet and their eyes met. Rodriguez had been there 3 years ago when they'd carried her unconscious from her jet. He'd been the one to find the mission recording, the black box that proved she'd saved 14 Marines by flying through a missile envelope that physics said was unsurvivable. He'd testified at the medical board, and they'd ignored him. The flight suit felt like a second skin, muscle memory older than thought itself. Alara climbed the ladder, her body remembering angles and movements that her conscious mind had tried to forget. The cockpit smelled exactly right: hydraulic fluid, electronics, and that indefinable scent of controlled violence. Her hands moved through the startup sequence without conscious thought: battery, fuel pumps, JFS, main engine start. The F-16's turbofan wound up with a scream that made her teeth ache and her heart sing. Through the canopy, she watched Halston climbing into his jet, his movements jerky with adrenaline or fear or both. The radio crackled, Reeves' voice steady as bedrock. "Valkyrie, this is Monarch Actual. You are cleared for immediate takeoff, runway 21. 4-ship formation will stack high at Angels 30. You're going in low under their radar envelope. Time to hostile engagement with civilian airspace: 6 minutes 30 seconds. Monarch Actual, Valkyrie copies. Beginning taxi." Her voice sounded different through the helmet, filtered and distant, but somehow more real than it had been in 3 years. She released the brake, felt the fighter surge forward with barely contained aggression. Beside her, Halston's jet moved into formation position. Over the tactical frequency, she heard the other 4 pilots checking in, their call signs forming a roster of America's best: Hammer, Sabre, Torch, and Ghost. Young, skilled, trained to perfection. About to die unless she remembered how to be the person she'd buried. "All aircraft, this is Valkyrie. We're not following standard intercept doctrine. The hostiles are flying a modified Sorkov bracket. If you engage according to training, you'll be dead before your missile warnings even finish their first tone." She turned onto the runway, the white line stretching toward the horizon like a sword pointing at heaven. "Hammer, Sabre, you'll maintain high CAP, create the illusion of standard response. Torch, Ghost, you're going to thread the needle between their eastern elements at exactly 4 minutes into engagement. I'll explain the timing. Halston, Your call sign is now Hammer 2. You stay on my wing and you do not, under any circumstances, break formation until I tell you. Understood. Silence on the radio, then Halston's voice smaller than before. Valkyrie Hammer 2 copies, stay on your wing. Good, because 3 years ago, my wingman broke formation during this exact scenario. I'm still finding pieces of her jet in my nightmares. Alara pushed the throttle forward. The afterburner lit like the birth of a new star, and the F-16 accelerated down the runway with the kind of acceleration that made internal organs remember they were just meat trying to keep up. At 150 knots, she pulled back, and gravity became a suggestion she chose to ignore. The Nevada desert fell away beneath her, brown and eternal and indifferent to the small dramas of humans and their flying machines. The air at 500 feet was thick and turbulent, thermals rising off the desert floor like invisible fists. Alara kept the jet low, using the terrain masking, staying under the hostile radar envelope. Her instruments painted a picture of organized chaos. The 4 American jets climbing to altitude, clean radar signatures announcing their presence like bulls in a china shop. The hostile formation shifting slightly, adjusting to take advantage of the predictable American response. And somewhere in that formation, a commander who understood the Surkov bracket well enough to modify it for modern electronic warfare. Someone dangerous. Someone who'd studied the manual and then burned it. Valkyrie Monarch Actual. Hostiles are reacting to our high element. Jamming has started, sporadic, targeted. Reeves sounded calm, but Alara could hear the tension underneath. 4 minutes to civilian airspace. Copy Monarch. Hammer, Saber, light them up. I want full radar, full electronic signature. Make them think you're the whole response. She banked hard left, following a canyon that would keep her hidden for another 90 seconds. Behind her, Halston's jet matched her maneuvers with rigid precision. The kid could fly, she'd give him that. Torch, Ghost, begin your descent. Thread point is 317 degrees. You'll see the gap in their formation in 90 seconds. They have to maintain it for the bracket to work. That gap is where their coordination breaks. Valkyrie Ghost, how do you know there'll be a gap? The pilot's voice was young, female, skeptical. Because the pilot who taught me the Surkov bracket died creating that gap. Russian instructor, defected in 2003. He told me the formation's beautiful because it's symmetrical, and fatal because symmetry requires predictability. Alara pulled up sharply, cresting a ridgeline, her jet silhouetted against the rising sun for exactly 2 seconds before dropping back into the terrain. Every 30 seconds, the wingmen have to shift position to maintain electronic warfare overlap. For 3 seconds during that shift, their mutual support breaks. That's when they're mortal. The tactical display updated. The hostile formation was now crystal clear in her helmet's HUD, 16 aircraft in a pattern that looked like a crown of thorns. Beautiful, deadly, executed by pilots who'd trained for this moment as long as she had. The 4 high American jets were now being painted by multiple fire control radars, the electronic warfare equivalent of having 16 laser sights on your chest. Valkyrie Hammer lead. They're jamming our communications. Intermittent now, but it's getting stronger. The pilot's voice crackled with static. Expected, they'll isolate you, then kill you individually. Don't let them. Alara's hands moved across the controls, adjusting weapons parameters. The AIM-120s under her wings were old, pulled from deep storage, but missiles didn't age like pilots. They just sat and waited for their moment of purpose. 3 minutes. The hostile formation was now close enough that Alara could see their contrails, white scars across the perfect morning sky. They were flying Chinese J-20s, 5th-generation stealth fighters that cost more than most small nations' GDP. Beautiful machines, nearly invisible to radar, loaded with weapons that could kill from beyond visual range. 16 of them against 5 American jets, one of which was being flown by a 53-year-old woman who wasn't supposed to be here. The mathematics of air combat were simple. First-shot advantage, numbers, technology. On all 3 counts, America was losing. But mathematics didn't account for memory, or rage, or the ghost of a woman named Whisper, whose last transmission still played in Alara's nightmares. 30 seconds to thread point, she transmitted. Torch, ghost, weapons tight until I call it. You shoot early, you die. You shoot late, civilians die. You shoot on my mark, we all go home. She pulled back on the stick, bleeding off speed, letting the hostile formation pull ahead slightly. Timing was everything. The Sorkov bracket worked because it forced the enemy to commit to an angle of attack. Once committed, the formation shifted to exploit that commitment. But during the shift, during those 3 seconds of transition, the mutual support broke. Halston, stay on my wing. We're going vertical in 20 seconds. Valkyrie Hammer 2, going vertical, copy. His voice was steadier now. Fear burned away, leaving only training and the thin hope that maybe this crazy woman knew what she was doing. The tactical display showed the 4 high American jets fully engaged now, their radar warning receivers screaming as multiple fire control systems locked on. The hostile formation was doing exactly what it was designed to do, overwhelming the Americans' ability to process threats. In 10 seconds, missiles would start flying, and good pilots would start dying. Alara counted heartbeats, watching the hostile wingmen, waiting for the shift. There, Eastern Element, 2 fighters breaking slightly apart, maintaining their electronic warfare envelope but sacrificing positional support. 3 seconds of vulnerability, bought with Russian blood 2 decades ago. Torch, ghost now. Thread the needle, weapons free on my mark. Alara slammed the throttle forward and pulled back hard. The F-16 shot upward like a prayer made metal, G-forces crushing her into the seat. Beside her, Halston's jet matched the maneuver, both aircraft climbing through 10,000 feet in seconds. The hostile formation saw them now, radar signatures blazing. Fire control radars shifted, trying to acquire new targets while maintaining locks on the high elements. The bracket fractured, just for a moment, just enough. Mark, Alara commanded and squeezed the trigger. An AIM-120 dropped from her wing, its motor igniting, accelerating to Mach 4 in seconds. Below her, Torch and Ghost's missiles joined hers, 3 weapons threading through the gap in the hostile formation, exploiting the 3-second vulnerability that shouldn't have existed. The sky turned into chaos painted in smoke trails and physics. The first hostile jet died in a ball of orange fire, the pilot never knowing what killed him. His wingman broke left, instinctively, abandoning formation doctrine for survival instinct. That broke the Eastern Element. 2 more hostile jets scrambled to adjust, their electronic warfare coordination dissolving like sugar in acid. The Sorkov bracket's beautiful symmetry cracked, and through that crack, possibility poured like light. All aircraft weapons free. Break their formation, make them fight as individuals. Alara rolled inverted and pulled through, diving back toward the furball that was developing. Her radar warning receiver was screaming, 3 different fire control radars painting her jet. She deployed chaff and flares, turned hard into one threat while her speed built. Beside her, Halston stayed locked on her wing like he was welded there, his jet responding to hers with mechanical precision. Hammer lead is engaged, 2 hostile tracks, jamming is heavy, the transmission cut off in static. The hostile electronic warfare was adapting, trying to isolate the American jets again. Alara switched to backup frequencies, military satellite communication that was harder to jam but slower to process. All aircraft alpha-alpha frequency. They can't jam what they can't predict. She triggered the switch on her own systems, watched her display flicker and then resolve. The tactical picture reformed, now showing 14 hostile jets, 2 down and 5 American aircraft still in the fight. The hostiles were no longer in formation. They were skilled pilots flying individually, but individual skill meant the bracket was dead. Meant this was now a knife fight, not an execution. Valkyrie Hammer 2 has radar contact, bearing 0905, 12 miles. Permission to engage. Halston's voice was tight with adrenaline. Negative Hammer 2, that's a feint. Look left 8 miles low, that's your threat. Alara had seen this before over the Caspian Sea. Chinese doctrine loved the feint flank, using one aircraft to draw attention while the real killer approached from the blind spot. Hard left, 90 degrees, engage with aim 9s when you get tone. She couldn't see if he followed her orders. She was too busy honoring her own. A J-20 had found her, locked on, closing fast. Her radar warning receiver wasn't screaming anymore, it was praying. She deployed countermeasures and turned into the threat, a purely insane maneuver that put her jet directly in the hostile's weapons envelope. But it also gave her a shot. For exactly 2 seconds, as the hostile pilot tried to process why his target was flying toward him instead of away, Alara had angles. She fired. One AIM-120, point-blank range by modern standards. The missile barely had time to arm before it impacted. The hostile jet disappeared in a cloud of debris and burning jet fuel. 2 minutes of combat that felt like 2 lifetimes. The Nevada sky was now painted with smoke trails and the burning contrails of dying aircraft. Alara's jet screamed through the chaos, her eyes processing threats faster than conscious thought. 3 hostile jets down, 12 still active. 5 American jets, all still transmitting, all still fighting. The civilians below were still drinking coffee, still completely unaware that their continued existence hung on the wire. Valkyrie, Ghost is hit, taking fire, I've got damage. The transmission dissolved into static and the sound of alarms. On Alara's display, Ghost's transponder flickered but held. Not dead yet. Not yet. Ghost, head south, emergency speed. Torch, cover her egress. Alara rolled left, her eyes finding another target. A J-20 lining up on Hammer leads 6 o'clock, perfect position, perfect angle. The pilot in that jet was good, patient, waiting for weapons lock. Hammer lead, break right now. She didn't wait to see if he complied. She turned hard, pulling 7 GS, her vision tunneling as blood struggled to reach her brain. Her anti-G suit inflated, squeezing her legs and abdomen, forcing blood upward. The F-16 groaned but held together. Old airframe, but Rodriguez maintained her like she was made of prayer and precision. The J-20 saw her coming, broke off its attack on Hammer lead, turned to engage. Pilot to pilot, skills versus skills, technology versus experience. The hostile pilot was younger, faster reactions, better aircraft. But Alara had died once already in a hospital bed. She had nothing left to lose except the people behind her. The merge happened at a combined closure rate of 1,200 knots. Both jets passed within 500 feet of each other, close enough that Alara saw the hostile pilot's helmet, the sun reflecting off his visor. Then they were passed, both turning hard, trying to get angles. Her jet was older, less stealthy, but smaller and more maneuverable at this altitude. She pulled tighter, accepted more GS, felt her ribs creak and her vision gray at the edges. The J-20 tried to match her turn, couldn't quite make it, overshot slightly. Slightly was enough. Alara's targeting reticle slid over the hostile jet like a blessing. Tone. She fired her last AIM-120. The missile leapt off the rail, tracked true, impacted the J-20's left engine. The Chinese jet didn't explode, it simply stopped being an aircraft and became a tumbling collection of parts. She saw the ejection seat fire, the parachute deploy. The pilot would survive to fight another day, but not this day. Valkyrie, Monarch actual. Hostile formation is breaking. Remaining aircraft are egressing east, full military power. Whatever you did, it worked. The smoke cleared slowly, revealing a sky that looked wounded. 8 hostile jets down or damaged, the rest running for international airspace with American fighters pursuing. Alara pulled out of her turn, her body feeling like it had been beaten with hammers. Every muscle ached, her hands were cramping on the stick. Her vision was still spotty from the G-forces. She was 53 years old, flying a 30-year-old jet, and she just survived air combat against the most modern fighters China could field. All aircraft check in. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. One by one the call signs responded. Hammer lead damaged but flying. Saber out of missiles but intact. Torch escorting Ghost back to base, both aircraft trailing fuel but alive. And Halston, Hammer 2, his voice carrying a different tone now, respect instead of mockery. Valkyrie Hammer 2, I'm on your 6-1 mile, you're leaking fuel. Port wing shows impact damage. Alara checked her gauges. He was right. Somewhere in the chaos, something had hit her jet, shrapnel probably from one of the kills. Her fuel was streaming behind her in a mist, not a catastrophic leak but enough to matter. She did the math in her head. Enough fuel to make it back to Nellie's, but not enough for a safe landing with reserve. It would be close. Copy Hammer 2, I see it, let's go home. The flight back took 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Alara kept her damaged jet stable, nursing the engine, watching her fuel gauge drop with steady inevitability. The Nevada desert passed beneath her, brown and eternal, the same desert that had watched humans fight and die for thousands of years. Below, Las Vegas sparkled in the morning sun, 2.3 million people going about their day, completely unaware of how close they'd come to having that day be their last. The radio crackled, Colonel Reeves' voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. Valkyrie Monarch Actual, your approach is cleared. Emergency equipment is standing by. The whole base is watching. You did good, Major. You did real good. Major, not Janitor. Not the old woman with the mop. The rank she'd held before the medical board had killed her career. The rank that came with the Hell's Angels patch still pressed against her heart. Monarch Actual, Valkyrie copies. Beginning approach. She lined up on the runway, the same white line she'd launched from a lifetime ago. 13 minutes. That's how long the fight had lasted. 13 minutes to save millions of lives. 13 minutes to prove that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest weapon you could carry. The F-16 touched down with a screech of tires and the smell of burning rubber. Alara pulled the drag chute, felt the deceleration push her forward into her harness. The jet rolled to a stop, fuel still leaking, but she was down. She was alive. Everyone was alive. The canopy opened and Nevada heat poured in like a physical thing. Chief Rodriguez was there, tears streaming down his weathered face unashamedly. Welcome home, Major. I told them you could still fly. Alara climbed down the ladder on legs that shook from adrenaline crash and exhaustion. The tarmac was crowded with people, maintenance crews, pilots, administrative staff, everyone who'd been watching on radar, everyone who'd seen what happened. They stood in silence, watching her, this woman in a borrowed flight suit who'd been pushing a mop 6 hours ago. Captain Derek Halston approached, his helmet off, his face pale. He stopped 3 feet away and saluted, sharp, proper, the kind of salute you gave to someone who'd earned every bit of respect the gesture could convey. Ma'am, I owe you my life, and I owe you an apology for the cartoon, and for everything else. Keep the apology, Captain. Use it to remember that you never know who you're looking at. That janitor might be the person who saves your ass. That quiet person in the back might be the one with the answers. Alara returned the salute, then dropped her hand to her side. You flew well today. Stayed on my wing when every instinct probably told you to break. That takes discipline. Colonel Reeves was walking across the tarmac, and the crowd parted for him like water. His uniform was crisp despite the early morning chaos, but his eyes carried the weight of a man who just burned his career to save his pilots. When he reached Alara, he didn't salute. He extended his hand. Major Voss, as of this moment, you are reinstated to full active duty status. The medical board's ruling is overturned by direct combat necessity. I'll face whatever inquiry comes, but today you proved that institutional procedure sometimes doesn't know its ass from its altimeter. He gripped her hand firmly. Welcome back to the war. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Welcome back to the war. Not just the war against external threats, but the war against being invisible, against being dismissed, against the assumption that age and gender and 3 years away from the cockpit meant you were finished. Alara had been dead for 3 years, a ghost pushing a mop through hallways of her former glory. But ghosts, it turned out, could still fly. Sir, about the inquiry. I'll burn that bridge when I get to it, Major. Right now, I need you in debriefing. 16 hostile jets with electronic warfare packages don't just appear over Nevada for a training exercise. Someone sent them, and someone needs to explain why they thought they could violate U.S. airspace with impunity. Reeves turned to address the crowd. Get back to work, all of you. The war didn't stop just because we won one battle. The debriefing room was sterile and cold, designed to drain emotion from events and reduce them to tactical data. But data couldn't capture the moment when Alara's first missile hit, or the way the hostile formation fractured like ice under pressure. Data couldn't record the terror in Ghost's voice when she called out damage, or the steady professionalism of Torch as he covered her escape. The analysts tried anyway, playing and replaying the radar recordings, the gun camera footage, the radio transmissions. 16 hostile jets, 8 destroyed or damaged, 0 American losses, 0 civilian casualties. By any measure, a decisive victory. But victories always tasted like ashes when you remembered all the times they'd tasted like defeat. The Sorkov bracket, an intelligence officer said, pointing to the tactical display. We haven't seen it used operationally since Syria. How did you know they'd deploy it? Because I killed the man who taught it to me. Alara's voice was flat, matter-of-fact. Russian instructor code-named Voron, the Raven. He defected in 2003, brought his tactical knowledge with him, taught a select group of American pilots how to counter his own country's doctrines. I was one of those pilots. He died in 2019 over the Caspian Sea, teaching me the final lesson, that the bracket's strength was its symmetry, and its weakness was that same symmetry. He flew into my missile intentionally, showed me the timing of the vulnerability window with his death. The room went silent. Someone coughed. The intelligence officer looked like he wanted to ask follow-up questions but didn't know where to start. Finally, another voice spoke up, Lieutenant Grace Morrison, the quiet pilot who'd watched everything unfold, who'd seen the transformation from janitor to savior. Ma'am, why didn't you tell anyone? 3 years ago when they grounded you, why didn't you fight it? Alara looked at her, really looked at her. Morrison was 34, competent, the kind of pilot who survived by being better prepared than everyone else. The kind who would face similar dismissal in 20 years when her reflexes slowed and some medical board decided her combat value was expired. Because I was tired, Lieutenant. Tired of fighting bureaucracy, tired of justifying my existence to people who'd never been shot at, tired of being measured against standards designed for 25-year-old men. I'd lost Whisper. I'd lost Voron. I'd lost the part of me that believed one more fight would matter. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They offered me a position as a civilian contractor, maintenance coordination, administrative work. I could have kept my rank, kept my pension, kept my office, but taking that would have meant admitting they were right, that I was used up. So I took the janitorial position instead, made them look at what they'd wasted every single day. The debriefing lasted 4 hours, every second of the engagement analyzed and documented. When it finally ended, Alara walked out into afternoon sun that felt like judgment. The base had returned to its normal rhythm, jets taxiing, maintenance crews swarming around aircraft, the endless machine of military readiness grinding forward. But something had changed. People looked at her differently now, not with the studied disinterest they gave janitors, but with recognition. She was visible again, for better or worse. Her quarters, the small apartment assigned to civilian maintenance staff, felt cramped after the cockpit's familiar embrace. She sat on the bed, still in her borrowed flight suit, and pulled the Hell's Angels patch from her pocket. The fabric was worn, the embroidery frayed at the edges. She'd carried it for 27 years, through 3 wars and countless missions. It had been on her chest when she'd flown her first combat sortie over Iraq. It had been there when Voron died. It had been there when Whisper's jet disintegrated, and Alara's world narrowed to the simple mathematics of survival. The knock on her door was soft but firm. She knew who it would be before she opened it. Captain Halston stood there, out of his flight suit now, wearing service khakis that made him look even younger. In his hands, he held something wrapped in cloth. "Ma'am, I wanted to return this. It fell out of your locker when we were getting your flight gear." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a photograph in a simple frame. Two women in flight suits, arms around each other's shoulders, both smiling with the casual confidence of people who'd never considered mortality. Ilara and Whisper, taken 3 years and a lifetime ago. "Thank you, Captain." She took the frame, her fingers finding familiar scratches in the metal edges. "Was there something else?" "I wanted to ask about the cartoon, the one I drew. I know saying sorry doesn't erase it, but I need you to know it wasn't personal. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask, because you looked at me and saw only what you expected to see. An old woman, a janitor, someone whose best days were history." Ilara's voice wasn't angry, just tired. "That's the lesson, Captain. Not that you should apologize for being young and stupid. We all were once. The lesson is that you never know who you're fighting alongside. That quiet analyst might have been special operations. That maintenance tech might be an explosives expert. That janitor might be the pilot who saves your life when doctrine fails." Halston nodded slowly, his face working through several emotions. "Morrison told me you lost your wingman to the Sorkov bracket. When you were ordering us around today, I thought you were just, I don't know, grandstanding, trying to relive glory days." He met her eyes. "I was wrong. You were remembering the cost of getting it wrong." That evening, Ilara found herself back in the ready room where the day had started. Someone had erased the whiteboard, removing the cartoon of Grandma Ground Crew like it had never existed. But she remembered it, would always remember it. The erasure didn't matter, the message remained. You could be skilled, experienced, legendary even, but if you were female and over 50, you were invisible until you proved otherwise. And proving otherwise required circumstances where lives hung in the balance. She sat in one of the leather chairs, still warm from the mission briefing that had just concluded. Colonel Reeves had addressed the squadron, laying out the new reality. The hostile incursion wasn't a one-time event. Intelligence suggested it was a probe, testing American response times and capabilities. There would be more. The war was changing, becoming something that lived in the shadows and tested boundaries in ways traditional doctrine didn't cover. "Mind if I join you?" Lieutenant Morrison stood in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. At Ilara's nod, she entered and handed over 1 cup, taking the seat beside her. They sat in silence for a moment, two pilots sharing the quiet that came after combat, when the adrenaline faded and the reality of what had happened, what could have happened, settled into bones and memory. "They're going to form a new squadron," Morrison said finally. "Response team for irregular threats. Electronic warfare, tactical innovations, situations that don't fit the standard playbook. Colonel Reeves is pushing for it at the Pentagon level. He wants you to lead it." "I'm 53 years old, Lieutenant. There are pilots half my age with twice the flight hours in modern aircraft. But none of them have died and come back. None of them have spent 3 years watching and learning while everyone assumed they were finished." Morrison turned to look at her directly. "I've been flying for 12 years, made lieutenant last year. I'm good at my job, maybe even great on good days. But watching you today, I realized I've been flying scared. Scared of making the wrong call, scared of standing out, scared of the 1,000 small ways the service finds to tell women we don't quite fit. You flew angry. Like you had nothing left to lose." "I don't." Ilara sipped the coffee, bitter and institutional. "When you've already been killed by bureaucracy, actual death becomes less frightening. That's not a healthy mindset, Lieutenant." "Maybe not, but it's effective." Morrison smiled slightly. "They're calling you Valkyrie again, the name spreading through the base. By tomorrow, every pilot in Nevada will know the story. The janitor who saved Las Vegas, the ghost who came back." 3 days later, Ilara stood in Colonel Reeves' office, the desert sunset painting the walls orange and gold. Between them, on his desk, lay a folder stamped with security clearances that restricted it to a list of people shorter than most shopping lists. Inside were orders, specifications, the skeletal framework of something that might become legend, or might become another forgotten experiment in military innovation. Task Force Valkyrie, Reeves said, tapping the folder. Rapid Response Unit for Unconventional Aerial Threats. Small team, hand-picked personnel, authorization to engage without standard chain of command approval in crisis situations. You'd have tactical autonomy, access to any aircraft in the inventory, and a budget that would make most squadron commanders weep with envy. You're describing a unit that bypasses oversight, Colonel. The kind of thing that causes congressional hearings and ends careers. I'm describing a unit that would have saved Whisper 3 years ago, that would have stopped today's incursion before it threatened civilian airspace. He leaned back in his chair, and the sunset made his face a study in contrasts, light and shadow, conviction and doubt. The world is changing, Major. Our enemies aren't flying in clean formations with clear insignias anymore. They're probing, testing, using deniable assets and electronic warfare to create chaos. We need pilots who can think faster than doctrine, who have seen enough combat to know when to break the rules. You need pilots desperate enough or crazy enough to take missions that might end their careers. I need pilots like you, like Morrison, who volunteered immediately when she heard about the unit, like Torch, who spent the last 3 days studying the Sorkov bracket because he wants to understand what you knew, like Halston, who went from drawing cartoons to asking if he could join your team because he saw what real combat leadership looks like. Reeves pushed the folder across his desk. This is happening, Major. The only question is whether you lead it, or whether I find someone else who will do it worse. Ilara picked up the folder, felt its weight. Inside were names, personnel files, tactical assessments. Morrison's file was on top, her service record perfect except for one notation. Demonstrates initiative beyond current assignment scope. In other words, she'd been too good at her job, made her superiors uncomfortable with competence they couldn't quite control. The rest of the files told similar stories. Pilots who'd been passed over for promotion, or sidelined for being difficult, or simply forgotten because they didn't fit the standard mold. You're giving me a squadron of misfits and outcasts. I'm giving you a squadron of people who survive by being better, not just different. People who will follow your orders because they understand that doctrine is written in the blood of people who learn too slowly. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the flight line where jets sat ready. Whisper died because we followed procedure. Today, civilians lived because you didn't. The next morning, Ilara stood on the tarmac as the sun rose over Nevada's endless brown horizon. 6 pilots stood before her. Their service records a collection of excellence and irregularity. Lieutenant Morrison, competent and quiet, eyes sharp. Captain Halston, humbled by combat, ready to learn. Major Carlos Torch, Ramirez, 15 years of service, twice passed over for promotion because his tactical innovations made senior officers uncomfortable. Captain Yuki Ghost Tanaka, the pilot who'd taken damage in the fight and landed her burning jet with the kind of precision that turned physics into prayer. Lieutenant James Saber O'Connor, Irish-American, third-generation military, who'd been disciplined for questioning orders that would have gotten his squadron killed. And Captain Rebecca Hammer Washington, the only pilot who'd maintained formation discipline during the chaos, whose steady professionalism had kept the high element alive. They stood at attention, 6 pilots waiting to learn what Task Force Valkyrie would become. Behind them, 6 aircraft sat on the flight line, not the newest jets, not the most advanced technology. These were the workhorses, the F-16s and F-15s that had proven themselves across decades of combat. Reliable, maintainable, deadly in the right hands. "You're here because you don't fit," Ilara said, her voice carrying across the tarmac. "You're too smart, too creative, too willing to question doctrine when doctrine would get people killed. The Air Force doesn't quite know what to do with you, so they gave you to me. I'm the 53-year-old woman who was pushing a mop a week ago. The one who proved that being underestimated is sometimes the best tactical advantage you can have." She paused, watching their faces. No mockery now, no dismissal, just attention, sharp and focused. Task Force Valkyrie exists to handle the threats that don't fit neat categories, the missions that require thinking instead of following checklists. We'll study enemy tactics that aren't in the manual. We'll train for scenarios that the Academy doesn't teach. And we'll do it knowing that every mission might be the one that ends our careers, because unconventional solutions make conventional leaders uncomfortable. Captain Halston raised his hand slightly, a gesture of respect rather than question. Ma'am, what's our first training scenario? You're going to learn the Sorkov bracket, not from a textbook, not from a simulation. You're going to learn it the way I did from someone who survived it. She gestured to a figure approaching from the operations building. An older man, walking with the slight limp of someone who'd ejected from aircraft at high speed and lived to remember it. This is Colonel Viktor Sokolov, retired Russian Air Force, defected in 2009. He flew with Voron. He knows the doctrine and he knows how to counter it. For the next 6 weeks, he's going to try to kill you. Tactically. You'll fly against him, study his methods, and learn why symmetry in combat is both strength and vulnerability. The training was brutal. Sokolov flew like physics was a suggestion and mercy was a foreign concept. He took each pilot up individually, demonstrated the bracket's terrible efficiency, destroyed them in simulated combat repeatedly. After each flight, they debriefed, analyzing failures, understanding the split-second decisions that meant death. Morrison lasted longest in her first engagement, nearly 4 minutes before Sokolov's simulated missile killed her. She landed white-faced and shaking, but the next day she was back, asking for another session. Halston crashed twice in the simulator, his jet's virtual wreckage painting the screen with failure. But he studied the recordings obsessively, staying up until 300 hours analyzing every maneuver, every decision point. By the 3rd week, he survived almost 7 minutes against Sokolov, long enough to see the vulnerability window Ilara had described. There, he said during the debrief, pointing at the recording. At the 6:42 mark, you have to shift position to maintain electronic warfare coverage. For exactly 2.7 seconds, your wingman can't support you. That's the gap. Sokolov smiled, the expression of a teacher watching a student achieve comprehension. Yes, that is the gap. The Russians tried for years to eliminate it. Cannot be done. Symmetry requires coordination. Coordination requires timing. Timing creates vulnerability. Is mathematical certainty like gravity. He turned to Ilara, his eyes carrying respect. Voron told me about you before he died. Said you were the only American pilot who understood that combat is not about technology. Is about understanding the pattern beneath the chaos. He died teaching me that lesson, Ilara replied quietly. I'd prefer my students learn it less expensively. By the end of 6 weeks, Task Force Valkyrie could execute and counter the Sorkov bracket. More importantly, they'd learned to see patterns in chaos, to recognize the gaps in enemy doctrine that turned coordinated formations into vulnerable targets. They'd learned that being smaller, older, flying outdated aircraft didn't mean defeat. It meant adaptation, creativity, using the enemy's assumptions about inferiority as camouflage. Colonel Reeves attended the final training exercise, watching from the observation room as Task Force Valkyrie engaged Sokolov's simulated force. The Russian flew with 4 other instructors, experienced pilots all, executing the bracket perfectly. The engagement lasted 14 minutes. When it ended, 3 of the aggressor force were dead, and Task Force Valkyrie had sustained only 1 loss. Halston, who'd sacrificed his position to give Morrison a clear shot. Not bad, Sokolov said during debrief. You fly like Voron trained you, Major Voss, with brain, not just reflexes. You're saying we think too much, Morrison asked, curiosity in her voice. I am saying you think correctly. Most pilots, they train reflexes until brain stops working. You train brain to use reflexes as tools is different. He looked at each pilot in turn. You will survive. Maybe not forever, nobody survives forever, but longer than most. The alert came on a Thursday morning, 3 months after Task Force Valkyrie's formation. Ilara was in the ready room, reviewing tactical studies, when the secure phone rang with the tone that meant life or death was measured in minutes. Colonel Reeves' voice was controlled but tight with urgency. "Major, we have an incident developing. Civilian aircraft, hijacked, heading toward San Francisco. 247 passengers. The hijackers are broadcasting demands and have indicated they're willing to crash the aircraft into civilian infrastructure if intercepted." Rules of engagement. Ilara was already moving, her body responding before her mind finished processing. Behind her, the squadron had heard the alert tone, was suiting up with practiced efficiency. "Don't let them reach San Francisco. Beyond that, use your judgment. Task Force Valkyrie was created for situations like this, Major. You have full tactical authority." 6 minutes later, 6 aircraft screamed off the runway, climbing into a sky that looked deceptively peaceful. The civilian aircraft, a Boeing 777, was 180 miles out, descending slowly, broadcasting incoherent demands about economic justice and the failures of capitalism. Analysis suggested the hijackers were amateurs, dangerous precisely because they were unpredictable, operating outside any known terrorist organization's playbook. "All aircraft, this is Valkyrie. We have 247 souls on that plane who didn't ask to be part of someone's political statement. Our job is to save them without killing them. Ideas?" Ilara kept her jet positioned between the 777 and San Francisco, visual contact established, the massive civilian aircraft looking graceful and doomed in the clear air. "Valkyrie, Hammer here. Can we communicate directly with the cockpit?" Washington's voice, steady and analytical. "If we can establish dialogue, maybe talk them down." "Negative. They've ignored all communication attempts. Whatever's driving them, it's beyond rational conversation." Ilara studied the 777, watching its flight characteristics. The aircraft was stable, well-controlled, which meant at least one hijacker knew how to fly. That was both good and bad. Good because they weren't immediately suicidal, bad because they had the skill to make intentional impact devastating. "Valkyrie, Morrison here. What if we don't try to stop them? What if we guide them?" A pause, then her voice returned, more confident. "They want attention, want to make a statement. What if we offer them a target that looks significant but is actually just empty desert? Make them think they're winning." Ilara considered it. Unconventional, risky. Exactly the kind of thinking Task Force Valkyrie was created to enable. "Explain your thinking, Morrison." The plan formed in midair, built from fragments of doctrine and desperate innovation. Morrison's idea was simple in concept, complex in execution. Use Task Force Valkyrie's jets to visually guide the hijacked aircraft toward what appeared to be a critical target, a military installation that was actually a decommissioned facility in the Nevada desert. Let the hijackers think they were succeeding, right up until the moment federal response teams could secure the aircraft on the ground. "The installation has runways, minimal security presence, and looks exactly like an active military base from the air," Morrison elaborated. "We broadcast mock panic on frequencies we know they're monitoring, make them think they've outsmarted our response. Guide them in like we're desperately trying to stop them, but actually just herding them toward landing." "It's psychological manipulation," Torch added. "Make them think they're winning until they're on the ground and surrounded." The risk was profound. If the hijackers realized they were being guided, they might do something desperate. If Task Force Valkyrie couldn't sell the deception, 247 people would die. But the alternative, shooting down a civilian aircraft over American territory, would haunt every pilot who pulled that trigger until the day they died. Monarch Actual Valkyrie, requesting approval for unconventional engagement strategy. Ilara transmitted the plan in compressed detail, watching the 777 continue its steady approach toward the coast. The response came back in 30 seconds, longer than a lifetime, faster than hope. "Valkyrie approved. Federal response teams are being deployed to the decommissioned facility. You have tactical control. Make it work. The deception began. Task Force Valkyrie split into two elements, three jets that appeared to be desperately trying to intercept the 777, making aggressive maneuvers that looked threatening, but carefully avoided actually endangering the civilian aircraft. The other three jets, including Alara's, stayed at distance, coordinating on secure frequencies, positioning themselves to subtly influence the 777's flight path. All aircraft execute on my mark. Make it look like chaos. Sabre, you're going to make a high-speed pass that looks like an attack run but misses by safety margin. Halston, follow up with weapons radar lock active ping. I want them to know you're tracking them. Washington, position between them and San Francisco, force them to choose a new heading that happens to align with our target facility. Alara's voice was calm, clinical, the tone of someone playing three-dimensional chess with lives as pieces. The execution was flawless. Sabre's F-15 screamed past the 777 at 600 knots, close enough that the hijackers would have felt threatened, far enough that no danger existed. On the monitoring frequencies, they heard the hijackers' communication shift from determined to panicked. Good. Halston's radar lock was the second act, his weapon system painting the 777 with targeting information that the aircraft's basic warning systems would detect. Inside that cockpit, alarms were screaming, lights flashing, telling the hijackers they were about to be shot down. The 777 banked hard left, exactly as predicted, moving away from San Francisco, heading toward the inland route that would take them over the decommissioned facility. Valkyrie, they're taking the bait, Morrison transmitted. Flight path now aligned with target facility, ETA 17 minutes. Copy, Washington, make your run now. Force them lower, into the trajectory we need. Alara watched the ballet unfold. 6 military jets and 1 civilian aircraft performing a deadly dance where every step was choreographed to look spontaneous. Washington's F-16 positioned directly in the 777's flight path, high enough to avoid collision, low enough to force the civilian aircraft to descend to avoid her. The hijackers took the bait, diving lower, burning fuel in the maneuvers, setting themselves up for the approach they didn't know was coming. On the ground, federal response teams were scrambling. The decommissioned facility, officially named Dreamland II, a testing ground abandoned 15 years ago, suddenly had vehicles pouring in, tactical units positioning themselves around the runway, crisis negotiators preparing for the moment when the aircraft touched down and illusion met reality. All aircraft, they're committed now, Alara transmitted. 15 minutes to landing. Stay in position, maintain the pressure, don't let them realize they're being guided. She checked her fuel. Enough for 30 more minutes, then she'd have to break off. But 30 minutes would be enough. It had to be. The 777 descended steadily, the pilots, hijackers, amateurs playing at terrorism, following the path of least resistance, thinking they were evading interceptors, not realizing they were being herded like cattle. At 10 minutes out, they began broadcasting again, their message a mixture of triumph and desperation. You cannot stop us. We will strike at the heart of American militarism. The world will remember this day. Let them remember it, Torch muttered on the tactical frequency. Just let them remember it from a prison cell instead of a crater. The landing was almost gentle. The 777 touched down on Dreamland II's runway, still operational despite the facility's abandonment, the hijackers probably thinking they'd achieved their goal. The aircraft rolled out, began to slow, and that's when the federal vehicles surrounded it, moving in from concealed positions. SWAT teams, negotiators, the full machinery of domestic response deploying with practiced precision. From altitude, Alara watched the operation unfold. The hijackers realized too late that they'd been played, but by then they were stationary, surrounded, their choices narrowing to surrender or suicide. They chose surrender. All 247 passengers walked off that aircraft alive, traumatized but breathing. The debriefing happened in Washington, D.C., in a room with no windows and security measures that made Nelly's Air Force Base look like a tourist attraction. Pentagon officials sat across from Task Force Valkyrie, their faces carrying expressions ranging from approval to profound unease. What Alara's team had done was effective, creative, and completely outside standard doctrine. It saved lives. It also set precedents that made bureaucrats nervous. Major Voss, your unit demonstrated remarkable tactical flexibility. The speaker was a three-star general whose name tag read Harrison, but whose reputation preceded him as the man who'd killed more innovative programs than enemy aircraft. However, the deception tactics employed raise questions about oversight and authorization procedures. You effectively waged psychological warfare against civilians, albeit hostile ones. Sir, with respect, we waged psychological warfare against hijackers who were threatening to crash an aircraft into civilian infrastructure. The 247 passengers were never at risk from our actions. They were only at risk from the people who seized their aircraft. Alara kept her voice even, respectful but firm. Task Force Valkyrie exists precisely for situations that don't fit neat doctrinal categories. And that's the concern, Major. A unit with tactical autonomy, operating outside standard chain of command, using methods that blur the line between military action and law enforcement. Harrison leaned back, his chair creaking. What you did worked. This time. But what happens when unconventional tactics lead to unconventional failures? Who takes responsibility when creative solutions create collateral damage? Morrison spoke up, her voice calm but carrying an edge. Sir, conventional tactics would have meant shooting down that civilian aircraft. 247 people would be dead, and we'd be having a different conversation about responsibility. Task Force Valkyrie's existence is predicated on the idea that sometimes the conventional solution is the wrong solution. The room went quiet. Junior officers didn't typically speak at Pentagon briefings, especially when addressing generals. But Task Force Valkyrie wasn't typical, and everyone in the room knew it. Harrison looked at Morrison, then at Alara, then at the rest of the team. His expression shifted subtly, from bureaucratic concern to something that might have been respect. Point taken, Lieutenant, though I'd suggest you work on your phrasing for future briefings. He stood, gathered his papers. Task Force Valkyrie is being given expanded operational authority. You'll report directly to NORTHCOM for domestic threats, to PACOM for Pacific operations. Your mission parameters remain intentionally vague because we can't predict what threats you'll face. But understand this, unconventional units live or die on results. You've bought yourself credibility with this hijacking resolution. Don't spend it stupidly. 6 months later, Task Force Valkyrie had become something between legend and bureaucratic anomaly. They'd responded to 7 incidents, aerial threats, yes, but also situations that required skills beyond pure piloting. A cyber attack on air traffic control that required Morrison's background in computer systems. A situation with a rogue drone swarm where Torch's creative thinking turned children's toys into a defense network. Each mission built reputation, but also scrutiny. Unconventional success made conventional leaders nervous. Alara stood in the ready room, now unofficially designated as Task Force Valkyrie's headquarters. The walls were covered with tactical maps, operational photos, and one picture that she'd placed there herself. The photograph of her in Whisper, smiling before everything went wrong. The squadron had added their own touches, Morrison's tactical flowcharts, Halston's increasingly sophisticated threat analyses, Torch's collection of impossible problems that they used as training scenarios. "Ma'am, got a minute?" Captain Tanaka stood in the doorway, her expression carrying something that might have been concern. "There's something going around. Rumors. Some of the other squadrons are calling us the Ghost Wing, saying we handle missions that officially don't happen. It's creating distance." "We are ghosts, Captain. That was always the nature of this unit." Alara turned from the wall. "We exist in the space between official policy and practical necessity. Other squadrons fly by the book because the book works most of the time. We fly when the book fails. But it's isolating us. The newer pilots, the ones still in training, they see us as separate, different. Some of them are saying we're too old, too unconventional, that we should step aside for younger pilots who understand modern warfare. Tanaka paused. Halston heard one of them call you Grandma Valkyrie. He nearly started a fight. The irony wasn't lost on Alara. Full circle back to mockery, but this time it was based on respect rather than dismissal. Still, it stung. She was 54 now, had been flying combat operations again for almost a year, and the physical toll was undeniable. Her hands ached after long flights. Her reaction time, while still sharp, required more conscious effort. She was still competent, but for how much longer? Tell Halston not to start fights on my behalf. If being called Grandma bothered me, I wouldn't have spent 3 years as a janitor. She managed a slight smile. But the larger point is valid. Task Force Valkyrie can't be about age or gender or unconventional tactics. It has to be about results, about training the next generation to think beyond doctrine. So what's the succession plan, ma'am? The question hung in the air like ordnance waiting to drop. Alara had been avoiding it, focusing on missions and training, but eventually every warrior had to acknowledge mortality, not the dramatic kind that came from missiles and crashes, but the slow erosion of capability that time inflicted without mercy. She was 54. Morrison was 35. The gap between them was nearly 20 years, a canyon that would only widen. Task Force Valkyrie couldn't be dependent on one aging pilot, no matter how skilled. It needed to be an idea that survived its founder. You're asking if I'm training my replacement. Alara walked to the window, looked out at the flight line where jets sat ready. I'm training 6 replacements, Captain. This unit works because it's collective, unconventional thinking, not individual heroics. When I can't fly combat anymore, and that day is coming, Task Force Valkyrie continues because you've all learned to see the patterns beneath the chaos. Morrison's the obvious choice for command, Tanaka said quietly. She thinks like you, sees the second-order effects, the psychological angles. Morrison's brilliant tactically, but she needs more command experience. Needs to learn how to fight battles at the Pentagon, not just in the air. Alara turned back. You're all capable of leading this unit. My job isn't to identify one successor. It's to ensure that Task Force Valkyrie becomes a methodology, not a cult of personality. The conversation was interrupted by the alert klaxon, that sound that never got easier to hear, that spike of adrenaline that turned peaceful moments into combat readiness. Alara and Tanaka were running before conscious thought caught up, their bodies remembering the patterns. Suit up, brief, launch. The ready room filled with Task Force Valkyrie, 6 pilots moving with practiced efficiency. Colonel Reeves appeared on the briefing screen, his face grim. Multiple unidentified aircraft, bearing 270, approaching Alaskan airspace. Electronic signatures suggest advanced 5th-generation fighters, possibly Chinese J-20s, possibly something newer. They're jamming commercial aviation frequencies, creating chaos in civilian air traffic. NORAD wants them intercepted and identified without escalating to actual combat. You have tactical authority, Major. Wheels up in 3 minutes. The mission brief was sparse because the situation was evolving too rapidly for detailed planning. Unknown number of hostile aircraft, unknown intentions, approaching American airspace in a region where response times were measured in heartbeats. Task Force Valkyrie would be flying into uncertainty, armed with creativity and the hard-won lessons of previous encounters. Listen up, Alara addressed her squadron, her voice carrying the weight of experience and something deeper, legacy. We don't know what we're facing. Could be a probe, could be a test of our response doctrine, could be the prelude to something larger. But we do know this. Someone is banking on us following predictable patterns, on us responding with overwhelming force or bureaucratic hesitation. We're going to respond with neither. The Alaska deployment was brutal, not because of combat, but because of the environment. Flying combat air patrol over the Bering Strait in November meant whether that treated aircraft like toys and pilots like inconvenient biology. Temperatures at altitude dropped to -60. Ice formed on wings faster than de-icing systems could handle it, and visibility shifted from perfect to zero in seconds. The hostile aircraft. They'd identified 11 J-20s operating in coordinated pairs, used the weather like a weapon, appearing and disappearing in cloud banks, testing American response times and tactics. For 3 weeks, Task Force Valkyrie maintained rotation in Alaska, flying exhausting patrols, shadowing the hostile aircraft, documenting their tactics without engaging. The Chinese jets never entered American airspace, staying just outside the boundary, but their presence was a message. We can get this close, we can operate in your environment, we know you're watching. It was psychological warfare executed with precision, and it was working. Other American squadrons rotated through, maintained standard patrol patterns, flew by doctrine. The Chinese jets adapted to each squadron's tactics, learned their patterns, became better at exploitation. Then Task Force Valkyrie arrived and changed the pattern. "They're expecting us to mirror their flight paths," Morrison observed during one mission debrief, her face lined with fatigue. "Every time we establish a patrol pattern, they probe it, test the boundaries. We're being predictable." "So we become unpredictable," Alara replied. "We stop patrolling and start hunting. Not to engage, we're still under orders to avoid combat, but we shadow them on their terms, not ours, make them react to us instead of us reacting to them." The shift was subtle but profound. Task Force Valkyrie stopped flying predictable patrol routes. Instead, they positioned themselves where the hostile aircraft would be before they got there, using weather patterns and tactical analysis to predict movement. They appeared in unexpected places, maintained positions that should have been impossible given fuel limitations, used terrain and cloud cover the same way the Chinese jets did. After 2 days of this new approach, the hostile aircraft became more cautious. After 4 days, they started making mistakes. After a week, they withdrew to international waters, their probe complete but their confidence shaken. "Valkyrie, NORAD Command. Hostile aircraft have broken off their patrol patterns and are returning to contested waters. Mission is assessed as successful. RTB when ready." The transmission carried relief and something else, acknowledgement that Task Force Valkyrie's unconventional approach had succeeded where conventional tactics had only managed stalemate. The flight home took 4 hours, refueling twice, crossing from Alaska's frozen hostility back to Nevada's familiar desert. Alara felt every one of her 54 years in her bones, the cold having settled deep into joints and muscles. Beside her, flying wing position out of respect rather than necessity, Morrison's jet maintained perfect formation. Below them, America stretched out in vast indifference, millions of people going about their lives, completely unaware of the small dramas that happened at Angels 30. The awards ceremony was held on a clear January morning, the Nevada sun doing little to fight off winter's chill. Alara stood at attention on the reviewing stand, Task Force Valkyrie arrayed behind her. As a 3-star general, she'd never met red citations that turned chaos into commendations and fear into formal recognition. The Distinguished Service Medal for the Las Vegas incident. The Defense Superior Service Medal for the hijacking resolution. Unit citations for operations that weren't named and missions that officially didn't happen. Each medal came with applause, with handshakes, with photographs that would hang on walls in buildings she'd never visit. But the moment that mattered came after the ceremony, when the formality dissolved and the pilots clustered in small groups, sharing stories in silence. A young officer approached, couldn't have been more than 25, fresh from training, her uniform still crisp with newness. She saluted precisely, then spoke with the careful respect of someone addressing a legend. "Major Voss, I wanted to thank you. I've been following Task Force Valkyrie's operations since the formation. I'm a pilot, just finished training, and I was told throughout the academy that women my age needed to fly perfect patterns, follow doctrine exactly, prove ourselves twice as hard for half the recognition. She paused, choosing her words. Then I saw your unit, saw that excellence isn't about perfection or following rules. It's about understanding when rules apply and when they're just obstacles to mission success. You've changed what's possible. Alara looked at this young officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her name tag Reed, and the coincidence made Alara's breath catch, and saw echoes of whisper of herself 30 years ago, of every woman who'd been told she was too female, too old, too unconventional to matter. Lieutenant, the only thing I've changed is the assumption that being underestimated is weakness. Use that assumption. Let people dismiss you, underestimate you, assume you're less capable. Then show them what you actually are when it matters. That's not deception, that's strategy. Is that why you became a janitor, ma'am? Strategy. Partly, also exhaustion, grief, and the sincere belief that I was finished. Alara smiled slightly. Turns out being finished is temporary if you're willing to push a mop until someone needs you to push a stick instead. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Reeves, who'd been watching from a distance with the expression of a man seeing his gamble pay off. Major, a word when you have a moment. They walked away from the crowd, toward the flight line where jets sat in silent rows. Reeves didn't speak immediately, just walked, and Alara recognized the pattern. The slow approach to a difficult conversation, the gathering of thoughts before impact. The Pentagon wants to expand Task Force Valkyrie. 6 more pilots, additional aircraft, formal integration into NORAD's response structure. He stopped, turned to face her directly. They're also suggesting it's time to promote you to Lieutenant Colonel, formalize your command position. The promotion should have felt like victory. It was recognition, validation, the military's way of saying her unconventional approach had value. But Alara heard the subtext beneath Reeves' words, understood what he wasn't quite saying. Formalize meant bureaucratize, meant committees and oversight, meant the slow death of flexibility that made Task Force Valkyrie effective. What's the cost, sir? Reeves smiled, the expression carrying no joy. Direct cost. You get a better office, more paperwork, and the pleasure of attending budget meetings. Real cost. Task Force Valkyrie becomes an official unit with official doctrine. You'll report to a chain of command that includes people who have never pulled GS or made decisions with lives on the line. Your tactical autonomy gets replaced with coordinated response protocols. They're killing us with recognition. They're making you successful enough to control. That's how the system works, Major. You threaten too many conventional assumptions. Your squadron is too effective, too visible, too inspirational to pilots who start questioning why they need to follow outdated doctrine. So the system absorbs you, makes you official, files your edges down until you're just another specialized unit that's special in name only. He looked tired, this colonel who'd burned bridges to give her a chance. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know. And because you need to decide if you want to accept the promotion and fight that fight, or if you want to keep Task Force Valkyrie small, unofficial, and actually useful. The choice was elegant in its brutality. Accept promotion and watch her squadron die slowly, absorbed into bureaucracy. Refuse and maintain effectiveness but lose funding, support, the protective cover that official recognition provided. There was no good answer, which meant the right answer was probably the one that hurt most. How long do I have to decide, sir? You already know what you're going to choose, Major. I can see it in your face. Same expression you had when you dropped that mop and told me you could fly. You're going to refuse the promotion, keep your squadron small and irregular, and hope you can accomplish enough before the Pentagon decides you're more trouble than you're worth. Reeves pulled an envelope from his pocket, handed it over. Which is why I prepared this. Transfer orders for 6 pilots I've identified as potential Task Force Valkyrie members. They're currently scattered across different bases, each one facing some variation of the treatment you got. Too good, too unconventional, too willing to question doctrine. You bring them in, Train them in your methodology. Create the next generation of Valkyries before the Pentagon files this whole experiment under Lessons Learned. Alara opened the envelope, scanned the names and service records. 3 women, 3 men, ages ranging from 28 to 45, each file carrying that same notation. Demonstrates initiative beyond current assignment scope. Each one a pilot who'd been sidelined, underestimated, told they didn't quite fit. Building the next generation took 8 months of brutal training, tactical innovation, and the kind of teaching that happened in cockpits at 40,000 feet where mistakes meant death. The 6 new pilots arrived at Nellie's with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. Captain James Reardon, 45, had spent the last 7 years flying transport missions after questioning an order that would have gotten his squadron killed. Lieutenant Keiko Matsuda, 28, had been passed over for fighter training because she was too analytical, not aggressive enough. The evaluation failing to understand that analysis could be the most aggressive weapon in combat. Major Antonio Cruz, 39, former special operations pilot who'd been grounded after a mission went wrong in ways that weren't his fault but needed someone to blame. Alara stood before them in the ready room, Task Force Valkyrie's original 6 arrayed behind her like a statement of possibility. You're here because the system doesn't know what to do with you. You're too smart, too creative, too willing to see problems instead of just executing solutions. The Air Force told you that's a weakness. I'm here to tell you it's your greatest strength if you're willing to use it correctly. The training was designed around failure. Alara had each new pilot fly against impossible scenarios, outnumbered, outgunned, operating with degraded systems and incomplete information. She watched them fail repeatedly, analyzing how they responded to failure. Reardon approached each scenario methodically, treating it like a puzzle that could be solved if he gathered enough data. Matsuda found creative solutions that ignored conventional wisdom but worked because they surprised the simulated opponents. Cruz flew with the aggressive creativity of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant doing exactly what doctrine said never to do. After 2 weeks, Alara gathered all 12 pilots, the original Task Force Valkyrie and the 6 new additions, for a mission brief unlike any they'd experienced. Tomorrow, you're flying an exercise against aggressor forces. Traditional scenario: 4 hostile aircraft, unknown capabilities, approaching protected airspace. You'll be outnumbered, outgunned. The aggressors will be flying 5th-generation fighters with every advantage modern technology provides. She paused, watching their faces, seeing the calculation happening behind their eyes. Your aircraft will be F-4 Phantoms, Vietnam-era jets, maintained but fundamentally outdated. You'll have basic weapons, basic systems, and you'll be facing opponents who expect you to fail. Halston spoke up, his voice carrying disbelief. Ma'am, that's not a training exercise. That's a guaranteed loss. F-4s against 5th-generation fighters. We might as well throw paper airplanes. You're thinking about technology instead of tactics, Captain. Thinking about what the aircraft can do instead of what the pilots can exploit. Alara pulled up a tactical display, showed the F-4's capabilities, limited but not zero. The aggressors expect you to fail because they're measuring aircraft against aircraft. They're not accounting for pilot creativity, for using limitations as advantages, for making the enemy's assumptions their vulnerability. Morrison smiled, understanding. You want us to fight stupid. Tactically, I mean. Make them think we're incompetent until we're not. The exercise was scheduled for dawn, that liminal time when the Nevada desert held its breath before the sun's hammer fell. 12 pilots walked to the flight line, toward a row of F-4 Phantoms that looked like they'd been preserved in museums, then reconsidered for one last mission. The jets were old, brutally so, their lines speaking of an era when fighters were built for speed and guns rather than stealth and missiles. Chief Rodriguez met them at the aircraft, his weathered face carrying something between pride and concern. Birds are flight-ready, Major, maintained according to original specifications, armed with AIM-9 Sidewinders and 20 cannon. They're not modern, but they're honest aircraft. They'll do exactly what you tell them, no computer assistance, no fly-by-wire safety nets. You want to kill yourself, they'll help. You want to fly perfect, they'll let you. He handed Alara the maintenance logs. Good hunting, ma'am. Show those young pilots what experience looks like. The startup sequence was pure analog, switches and gauges instead of digital displays, the kind of flying where you felt the aircraft through the controls rather than trusting computers to interpret physics. Alara's F-4 came alive with a roar that spoke of raw power barely contained. On either side, the rest of Task Force Valkyrie completed their startups, 12 old jets preparing to face 4 modern fighters in what should have been a massacre. All aircraft, this is Valkyrie. Remember the briefing. We're not trying to win by modern standards. We're trying to survive by making ourselves unpredictable, unsurvivable by making our limitations into weapons. She taxied toward the runway, the F-4 responding with heavy directness. The aggressors expect us to use modern tactics in outdated aircraft. We're going to use outdated tactics in ways they've never trained against. Questions. Valkyrie, this is Cruz. Just one question, ma'am. Are we actually trying to win this or just survive? His voice carried the edge of someone who'd been told survival was victory too many times. We're trying to teach the aggressors that assumptions kill, Major. Whether that's winning or surviving depends on how well they learn the lesson. The merge happened at 20,000 feet, 4 modern fighters against 12 Vietnam-era jets. The tactical display painted a picture of technological mismatch. The aggressors' 5th-generation aircraft were nearly invisible to radar, carried weapons with ranges that exceeded the F-4's, capabilities by orders of magnitude, could engage from beyond visual range with near certainty. By every measure, Task Force Valkyrie should have been dead before they knew they were under attack. But assumptions were betrayers. The aggressors expected desperate evasion, modern defensive tactics, electronic warfare countermeasures. Instead, Task Force Valkyrie did something the aggressors' training had never prepared them for. They flew in close formation, tight enough that their radar signatures merged, appearing as fewer targets. They descended rapidly, using terrain masking that modern pilots rarely trained on because their aircraft's capabilities made it unnecessary. And they communicated using old-school hand signals and formation flying rather than radio, making electronic interception useless. The first aggressor pilot died in simulation because he assumed victory was inevitable. He lined up on what he thought was a single target locked on, prepared to fire. The F-4s broke formation at the last second, revealing 6 aircraft where his radar had shown 1. His missile, committed to a target that no longer existed, went ballistic. Before he could reacquire, Morrison's F-4 was inside his turned circle, guns tracking, simulated 20 rounds stitching across his fuselage. In modern combat, this close-range engagement should have been impossible, but modern combat assumed modern tactics. Aggressor 2 is dead, the controller's voice announced over the exercise frequency. Cause of death, gunfire at close range. Aggressor flight, you have 11 hostiles still active. The aggressors adapted. Good pilots always did. They separated, used their superior speed and technology to create distance, tried to reset the engagement on their terms. But Task Force Valkyrie didn't cooperate. They stayed low, used the terrain, split into elements that appeared and disappeared in the canyons and valleys that Nevada offered in abundance. The F-4s couldn't outrun the modern fighters, couldn't out-technology them, but they could outthink them. Reardon took the second aggressor. He positioned his F-4 in a canyon, engine at idle, radar off, effectively invisible to the modern fighter's sensors that were optimized for high-speed targets. When the aggressor passed overhead, Reardon lit his afterburner and climbed vertically, an insane maneuver in an aircraft not designed for it. The old jet groaned but held together, climbing fast enough to get a sidewinder lock from directly below. The missile tracked, hit, and another modern fighter became another lesson. Aggressor 3 is dead. Cause, aim 9 from a low-speed vertical engagement. Aggressor flight, you have 10 hostiles remaining, 2 friendlies down. The engagement lasted 17 minutes, ending when the remaining two aggressors, both skilled, both flying perfectly according to their training, flew into a trap that had been set using tactics from 1968. Six F-4s, positioned in a classic thatch weave formation that had been designed to counter Japanese Zeros, caught both modern fighters in overlapping fields of fire. The aggressors tried to escape using superior speed, but the thatch weave's geometry meant that accelerating only brought them deeper into the kill zone. Both jets died to gunfire, killed by tactics that were older than most of the pilots flying them. Exercise complete. Aggressor flight is assessed as destroyed. Task Force Valkyrie returned to base. The controller's voice carried disbelief and something that might have been respect. Debrief in 1 hour. I think everyone involved is going to want to understand what just happened. The debriefing room was packed, not just Task Force Valkyrie and the aggressor pilots, but observers from NORAD, from Training Command, from the Pentagon itself. They'd watched the exercise on tactical displays, seen 12 outdated aircraft defeat 4 modern fighters through tactics that weren't in any current manual. The silence in the room carried weight, the kind of silence that preceded paradigm shifts. One of the aggressor pilots spoke first, a major whose call sign was Reaper and whose record included training some of the Air Force's best pilots. With all respect, Major Voss, what we just experienced shouldn't have been possible. F-4s against fifth-generation fighters is a mismatch that technology should have decided. How did you? He trailed off, searching for words. How did you make our advantages irrelevant? We didn't make them irrelevant, Major. We made them assumptions. Alara stood, walked to the tactical display, replayed segments of the engagement. Every advantage you had, speed, stealth, beyond visual range weapons, those advantages work because they're based on expectations. You expected us to fly modern defensive patterns, to use electronic warfare, to engage at range. When we didn't do any of those things, your advantages became liabilities because you trained to exploit enemy behaviors we didn't exhibit. She paused the replay at the moment Morrison killed the first aggressor. Here, Captain Morrison got guns range kill because your pilot assumed close-range combat was impossible. His training, his experience, his aircraft's capabilities, all of it told him that F-4s couldn't get close enough to use cannon. So he didn't watch for it, didn't defend against it, and died to a tactic that was obsolete before he was born. Lieutenant Matsuda added her analysis, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who'd thought deeply about the engagement. The thatch weave we used to kill the last 2 aggressors, that formation was designed for aircraft with specific performance characteristics. Slower speed, limited weapons, visual range engagement. Your modern training doesn't include countering it because modern combat is supposed to happen at range, with missiles, with electronic systems providing awareness. When we forced you into a close-range visual engagement using old aircraft, you were suddenly fighting a war your training hadn't prepared you for. So you're saying modern training is inadequate? A voice from the back of the room, a colonel from Training Command, his tone defensive. That we should go back to teaching tactics from the Vietnam era. I'm saying modern training creates assumptions, Alara replied, her voice calm but firm. And assumptions are vulnerabilities. Task Force Valkyrie exists because warfare isn't about having the best technology. It's about understanding that the enemy has trained against your technology, your doctrine, your expected behaviors. Excellence isn't following the manual perfectly. It's knowing when the manual becomes a liability. The exercise results spread through the Air Force like wildfire through dry timber. Within days, training commands were requesting briefings. Within weeks, Task Force Valkyrie's methodology was being analyzed, documented, incorporated into tactical studies. Alara found herself giving presentations to rooms full of senior officers, explaining how being underestimated was tactical advantage, how outdated aircraft could defeat modern technology through creative application of obsolete doctrine. But success brought scrutiny. and scrutiny brought the inevitable bureaucratic response. Colonel Reeves appeared in the ready room on a Tuesday morning, his face carrying the expression of a man delivering news he'd tried and failed to prevent. "Major, the Pentagon has made a decision regarding Task Force Valkyrie. Your unit is being redesignated as the 1st Tactical Innovation Squadron. Official budget, official manning document, official integration into training command structure." Ilara felt the words land like body blows. Official, integration, structure, all the words that meant death by 1,000 memoranda. When? Effective immediately. You're being promoted to lieutenant colonel, non-negotiable this time. Your squadron will be expanded to 24 pilots and given a permanent station at Nelly's. Mission focus shifts from operational response to training and doctrine development. Reeves sat down heavily. "I fought it, Major. Spent 2 months arguing that formalizing your unit would kill what makes it effective. But the 3 stars want to replicate your success, scale it, make it systematic. They don't understand that systematic is the opposite of what you do." "Who's taking operational command?" Ilara's voice was distant, clinical. She already knew the answer. "Captain Morrison will lead the operational element, 6 pilots maintaining the rapid response mission. You'll oversee the training mission, develop curriculum, teach other squadrons to think unconventionally." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. You built something remarkable, and the system's response is to make it unremarkable through official recognition." Ilara stood at the window, looking out at the flight line. The F-4s from the exercise were being towed back to storage, their moment of relevance ending as quickly as it had begun. Morrison would make an excellent operational commander. She was smart, creative, understood the methodology. But Task Force Valkyrie had been more than methodology. It had been a statement that being dismissed, underestimated, pushed aside didn't mean you were finished. That there was power in being invisible until the moment you chose to be seen. When does the transition happen? You have 3 months to establish the training program, identify instructors, develop curriculum. Then the 1st Tactical Innovation Squadron becomes official, and Task Force Valkyrie becomes history. Reeves stood, preparing to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Major, Lieutenant Colonel, you changed how this service thinks about combat. That's a legacy that survives bureaucracy." The final 3 months of Task Force Valkyrie's independent existence felt like dying slowly. Ilara developed curriculum, wrote tactical manuals, gave presentations on unconventional thinking to audiences that took notes and nodded and fundamentally didn't understand that you couldn't systematize creativity. Morrison prepared to take operational command, training with the intensity of someone inheriting responsibility that felt too large to carry alone. The rest of the squadron, the 12 pilots who'd formed the core of something unique, prepared for integration into something normal. On the last day before the transition, Ilara gathered them all in the ready room one final time. No formal address, no ceremonial words, just 12 pilots and the woman who'd led them, sitting in a room that held 3 years of innovation and fear and triumph. "Tomorrow you become something official," she said finally. "The 1st Tactical Innovation Squadron with budget and manning and all the trappings of legitimacy. Some of you will stay with Morrison, maintaining the operational mission. Others will join me in training command, teaching other pilots to think unconventionally." She looked at each of them in turn. "But tonight, you're still Task Force Valkyrie. Still the squadron that shouldn't have existed, that saved Las Vegas by breaking every rule, that flew F-4s against 5th-generation fighters, and won because you understood that tactics matter more than technology." Captain Halston raised his hand slightly, the gesture respectful. "Ma'am, what happens to the name? Task Force Valkyrie, does that just disappear?" "Names are just words, Captain. What matters is the idea behind them. That being underestimated is sometimes the greatest weapon you can carry. That age and gender and 3 years away from the cockpit don't define capability. That excellence isn't about following doctrine. It's about understanding when doctrine becomes liability." She pulled something from her pocket, the Hell's Angels patch that had started everything. This patch represents a squadron that didn't officially exist but fought in wars that officially didn't happen. Task Force Valkyrie will officially end tomorrow, but the idea continues. In every pilot who questions doctrine when doctrine would get people killed. In every officer who chooses effectiveness over procedure. In every warrior who understands that sometimes being invisible is how you accomplish the impossible. She stood and they stood with her, 12 pilots who'd learned to fight by thinking rather than just following orders. Tomorrow they'd be something official, something the system could control and measure and gradually file into insignificance. But tonight they were still ghosts, still the squadron that existed in the spaces between rules and reality. It's been an honor flying with you, all of you. Alara's voice carried weight that formal ceremony couldn't capture. Whatever happens next, remember this. You were Task Force Valkyrie. You proved that being written off doesn't mean you're finished. That's a lesson the Air Force needs to relearn every generation. Make sure they remember. The room fell silent, and in that silence something shifted. A chapter ending, a legacy beginning. Tomorrow, Alara Voss would become Lieutenant Colonel Voss, training command, developing doctrine, teaching the next generation. But tonight, she was still Valkyrie, the woman who'd pushed a mop until the world needed her to push a stick instead. The woman who'd proved that legends could be janitors, and janitors could save millions of lives by refusing to accept that their story was over. In the Nevada darkness, 12 pilots dispersed, each carrying with them the understanding that excellence was rebellion, and that sometimes the greatest victory was making the system acknowledge that its assumptions about who mattered were catastrophically wrong. They'd been the underestimated, the dismissed, the written off. And for 3 years, they'd been extraordinary precisely because no one expected them to be. That was the legacy, not medals or commendations or official recognition. Just the simple truth that being invisible was temporary if you were willing to be undeniable when it mattered. The story would continue, in different forms, with different pilots, facing different threats. But the core idea would remain, that warriors came in unexpected packages, and that dismissing someone based on age or gender or 3 years away from the cockpit was a tactical error that wise opponents learned not to repeat. Alara walked alone to the flight line one last time as Valkyrie, the desert night cool against her face, the stars indifferent overhead. Tomorrow would bring change, bureaucracy, the slow death of innovation through official recognition. But tonight, the sky still belonged to ghosts who refused to stay dead, and the legend of Task Force Valkyrie, the squadron that laughed at assumptions and saved the world by being underestimated, would become the story whispered to every new pilot who felt dismissed, overlooked, told their best days were behind them. Sometimes being written off was just the beginning, and sometimes the quiet janitor with the old patch was exactly who you needed when doctrine failed and lives hung in the balance. That was the final lesson, the one that would outlive squadrons and careers, and even the pilots who'd learned it through blood and fear, and the terrible beauty of being right when everyone expected you to be wrong. Task Force Valkyrie ended at midnight, officially dissolved, absorbed into something systematic and controllable. But legends don't die through paperwork, and the idea that had saved Las Vegas and taught a generation of pilots to think beyond doctrine would continue in every warrior who understood that excellence was rebellion, and that being underestimated was the greatest tactical advantage of all.